June 4th, 1942. 10:20 a.m., 17,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Richard Best tightens his grip on the control stick. Below him, through scattered clouds and smoke, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers cut white wakes through blue water. The sun burns overhead. His radio crackles with static. Sweat runs down his face inside the cramped cockpit of his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. For 6 months, the Japanese Navy has been unstoppable. Their carriers have ranged across half the Pacific, crushing everything in their path. Now they sit below him, confident, exposed, vulnerable. Best pushes the stick forward. The Dauntless tilts into a 70-degree dive. The engine screams. The target grows larger in his bomb sight. He doesn't know it yet, but in 6 minutes, everything will change. 4 carriers will be burning. The war will turn, and the plane everyone called Obsolete will write history in fire and steel. 7 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. In 2 hours, they sank or damaged 8 American battleships and killed over 2,000 men. The attack shattered American naval power in the Pacific and announced Japan's arrival as a dominant maritime force. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carrier strike force, built around 6 fleet carriers, had executed the most devastating naval air attack in history. What followed was a cascade of Japanese victories. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila fell in January. Singapore, the British Empire's fortress in the east, surrendered in February with 85,000 troops captured. The Dutch East Indies collapsed in March. Burma was overrun by May. Across 6 months, Japan seized an empire stretching from the edge of India to the central Pacific Islands. Their carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, operated with near impunity, launching strikes wherever they pleased. American forces reeled. The Philippines were lost. Wake Island was taken. The Asiatic fleet was destroyed. Survivors retreated to Australia. The Pacific had become a Japanese lake, and their navy ruled it absolutely. Their pilots were veterans, many with combat experience in China dating back to 1937. Their tactics were proven. Their confidence was absolute. But beneath the surface of disaster, American intelligence officers were working in basement rooms in Hawaii. They were breaking Japanese naval codes. The work was painstaking, partial, fragmentary. But by late April 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Haipo had cracked enough of the Japanese JN-25 code to glimpse their next move. The target was labeled AF in intercepted messages. Rochefort suspected it meant Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. To confirm it, he orchestrated a simple trap. He ordered Midway to send an uncoded radio message reporting a problem with their water distillation plant. Days later, Japanese intelligence transmitted a message. AF is short of water. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, now knew where and when Japan would strike. He had perhaps 2 weeks to prepare. The Japanese plan was ambitious. Admiral Yamamoto intended to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap, destroy them, and force the United States to negotiate peace. He would use Midway as bait. 4 of his best carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, would strike the island first. Once American carriers rushed to defend it, Yamamoto's main battle fleet would crush them. It was a plan built on assumptions. The Japanese believed the American carrier Yorktown had been sunk in the recent Battle of the Coral Sea. They were wrong. She'd been damaged and was now being frantically repaired in Pearl Harbor. They believed the Americans would be slow to react. They were wrong again. And they believed their own carriers, veterans of 6 months of unbroken victory, were invincible. Nimitz gathered what he had. Enterprise and Hornet, already at sea. Yorktown, patched up in just 3 days after damage that should have required 3 months of repair. 3 carriers against 4. He placed Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance in tactical command of Enterprise and Hornet, an unusual choice since Spruance was a cruiser admiral, not a carrier man. But Spruance was calm, analytical, and deliberate. Nimitz trusted him. By late May, the American carriers were steaming toward a point northeast of Midway, designated Point Luck. The Japanese fleet was converging from the west. Neither side yet knew the other was coming. But the Americans had one critical advantage. They knew the Japanese plan. The Japanese had only assumptions. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was already being called obsolete by early 1942. It was slow, with a maximum speed of just 255 miles per hour. It was ungainly, with a wide fuselage, perforated dive brakes, and a rear gunner seated behind the pilot. Compared to sleek Japanese Zeros or even American fighters, it looked like a relic. Naval aviators nicknamed it the slow but deadly, or less charitably, the clunk. But the Dauntless had qualities that mattered more than speed. It was stable in a dive. Its perforated dive brakes, metal flaps that extended from the wings, allowed it to plunge nearly vertically at 70 degrees without accelerating out of control. This gave the pilot time to aim. It carried a 1,000-pound bomb under the fuselage and two smaller bombs under the wings. And it could take damage. Its airframe was rugged, its fuel tanks self-sealing. Pilots who flew it learned to trust it, even if they didn't love it. By June 1942, the Dauntless was the primary dive bomber on all three American carriers heading toward Midway. Enterprise carried Bombing Squadron 6, VB-6, and Scouting Squadron 6, VS-6. Yorktown carried Bombing Squadron 3, VB-3. Hornet carried Bombing Squadron 8, VB-8. Together, these squadrons represented the bulk of American dive bombing capability in the Pacific. Their pilots were a mix of veterans and green recruits. Some had flown combat missions in earlier raids on Japanese-held islands. Others had barely finished training. The Japanese, meanwhile, were supremely confident. Admiral Nagumo's carrier force, the Kido Butai, had annihilated the American battleships at Pearl Harbor, sunk the British carrier Hermes in the Indian Ocean, and struck targets from Darwin to Ceylon. Nagumo's flagship, Akagi, was a converted battlecruiser, fast and powerful, carrying 66 aircraft. Kaga, also a converted battleship, carried 72. Soryu and Hiryu were purpose-built fleet carriers, sleek and modern, each carrying 63 aircraft. Combined, the four carriers could launch over 260 aircraft: fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. The Japanese pilots were among the best in the world. Many had flown hundreds of combat hours. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and longer-ranged than any Allied fighter in the Pacific. Their Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers had proven devastatingly effective. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive, coordinated strikes. They believed in decisive engagement, one overwhelming blow to cripple an enemy fleet. But doctrine also bred rigidity. Japanese carriers required time to rearm and refuel aircraft between strikes. Their hangars were open, with aircraft stored on the hangar deck and flight deck simultaneously. Fuel lines ran exposed. Ammunition was stacked near aircraft. This allowed rapid launch cycles but created vulnerability. A bomb hitting the hangar or flight deck while aircraft were being fueled could trigger catastrophic fires. On the morning of June 4th, Nagumo launched his first strike at 4:30 a.m. 108 aircraft aimed at Midway's airfields and defenses. The attack damaged the island but didn't knock it out. American aircraft from Midway struck back, but their attacks were uncoordinated and ineffective. Nagumo's carriers swatted them away with minimal damage. Then, at 7 a.m., one of Nagumo's scout planes radioed a report. American ships sighted. The scout's radio was faulty. The message was unclear. Nagumo hesitated. His second-wave aircraft were on deck, armed with land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. If American carriers were nearby, he needed to switch those bombs to armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for ship attacks. He gave the order. For the next 2 hours, Japanese deck crews worked frantically. They hauled bombs off aircraft. They brought up torpedoes and armor-piercing ordnance. Aircraft were struck below to the hangar decks. Fuel lines were extended. The removed land attack bombs were stacked carelessly near bulkheads. And all the while, Nagumo's carriers steamed in formation, turning north to close with the reported American ships. At 9:20 a.m., American torpedo bombers arrived. First, 15 Douglas SBD Devastators from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8. They came in low and slow without fighter escort. Japanese Zeros and anti-aircraft fire tore them apart. 14 of 15 planes were shot down. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the water, watching the battle unfold. Then came Yorktown's torpedo squadron. Then Enterprise's, same result. 41 American torpedo bombers attacked. 35 were destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit. Japanese sailors cheered. Their fighters circled low, hunting the last stragglers. The deck crews kept working, readying the strike planes. No one on the Japanese carriers was looking up. The men flying the Dauntless dive bombers were not superhuman. They were young, most in their early 20s. Lieutenant Richard Best, commander of VB-6, was 29, practically ancient by squadron standards. Many pilots had less than a year of service. Some had never dropped a bomb in combat. They knew the odds. They'd watched the torpedo bombers go in. They'd heard the static and silence on the radio as squadron after squadron was wiped out. But they'd trained for this. Dive bombing required nerve and precision. The pilot pushed the stick forward, tipping the aircraft into a near-vertical plunge. The altimeter spun backward. The ocean rushed up. The target expanded in the bomb sight. A painted circle on the windscreen, crude but effective. At around 1,500 feet, the pilot released the bomb, then pulled hard on the stick, hauling the aircraft out of the dive. G-forces crushed down on chest and limbs. Vision grayed at the edges. The Dauntless shuddered, groaned, climbed. Training taught mechanics. Experience taught something else. When to trust instinct, when to hold steady despite the flak bursting around you, when to ignore the voice screaming in your head to pull up early. Richard Best had that experience. So did Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group. McCluskey had made a critical decision earlier that morning. When he couldn't find the Japanese carriers where intelligence predicted, he didn't turn back. He followed a hunch, spotted a lone Japanese destroyer heading northwest, and followed its wake. That hunch led him to the carriers. For the pilots, the battle wasn't abstract strategy. It was visceral. It was checking your fuel gauge and realizing you might not make it back. It was seeing your wingman's plane explode in mid-air. It was the smell of hydraulic fluid and sweat in the cockpit. It was the rear gunner behind you, swiveling his twin .30 caliber machine guns, calling out Zeros closing from behind. Ensign George Gay, floating in the water after his torpedo bomber was shot down, watched the dive bombers arrive. He saw them roll into their dives, one after another, like a choreographed dance. He saw the bombs falling. He saw the explosions. Later, he would describe it as the most beautiful and terrible thing he'd ever witnessed. The American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers by accident. There was no grand plan, no perfectly coordinated strike. The torpedo squadrons had gone in first, piecemeal, and been slaughtered. The fighters launched to escort the bombers had become separated. Most were low on fuel or chasing Zeros. The dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown launched at different times, flew different routes, and arrived at the target almost simultaneously, by sheer chance. Wade McCluskey's decision to search beyond the expected contact point delayed his arrival. That delay meant his squadrons arrived just as Yorktown's bombers were approaching from a different angle. Two American dive bomber groups, totaling nearly 50 aircraft, converged on 4 Japanese carriers at 10:20 a.m. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, 30 Zeros, was still down low, chasing the last American torpedo bombers. The sky above the carriers was almost empty. Spruance hadn't intended this. Neither had Fletcher commanding Yorktown. But the chaos of battle, the mistakes and delays, the desperation and luck, all of it combined into a single, perfect tactical moment. The Japanese carriers were exposed. Their decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. Their fighters were out of position, and the American dive bombers were above them, unseen. unopposed. McCluskey chose Kaga as his target. Best, leading VB-6, shifted to Akagi to avoid overlap. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading Yorktown's VB-3, selected Soryu. 3 carriers. 3 squadrons. 6 minutes. The Dauntless wasn't obsolete. It was purpose-built. Every design choice, the wide fuselage, the dive brakes, the sturdy landing gear, served a function. The perforated dive brakes, often mocked as old-fashioned, stabilized the aircraft during 70-degree dives, preventing the speed from building beyond controllability. This stability gave the pilot crucial seconds to line up the target. The bomb sight was simple. A fixed circle painted on a glass panel in front of the pilot. No complex optics. No electrical components to fail. The pilot aimed by maneuvering the aircraft until the target sat inside the circle, then released the bomb manually. Crude but effective. Skilled pilots could place a 1,000-pound bomb within a 50-foot radius from 2 miles up. The bomb itself, the standard AN-M64, 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb, was a blunt instrument. It didn't need to be sophisticated. Dropped from 15,000 feet and accelerated by a 70-degree dive, it struck with enough kinetic energy to punch through a carrier flight deck and detonate deep inside the ship. The explosion didn't need to sink the carrier outright. It just needed to ignite fuel, ammunition, or parked aircraft. The ship would do the rest of the work, consuming itself in fire. Japanese carriers had a fatal flaw. Their damage control doctrine was inadequate. American carriers compartmentalized fuel and ammunition, used pressurized water curtains, and trained damage control teams relentlessly. Japanese carriers prioritized rapid flight operations. Fuel hoses stayed connected longer. Ordnance sat exposed on the hangar decks. Damage control parties were smaller, less drilled. A single bomb in the right place at the right time could trigger cascading failures. The Dauntless wasn't obsolete. It was exactly what was needed. At 10:20 a.m., the Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable moment in the entire battle. Nagumo had ordered the second-wave aircraft rearmed from land attack bombs to armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes. This process was still underway. Aircraft sat on the flight decks and hangar decks, some fueled, some half-armed. Fuel hoses stretched across the decks. The land attack bombs removed earlier were stacked haphazardly along bulkheads and in passageways. Standard procedure to speed up rearming, but catastrophically dangerous if a fire started. Worse, Nagumo had just recovered his combat air patrol fighters. The Zeros had landed to refuel and rearm after chasing American torpedo bombers for over an hour. Many were on deck, others were circling low, still focused on the last stragglers of the torpedo attacks. No one expected a high-altitude threat. Radar was limited. Japanese carriers had only basic air search radar, and it hadn't detected the American dive bombers approaching from 17,000 feet. The anti-aircraft defenses, while formidable, couldn't track fast-moving dive bombers plunging from altitude. Japanese doctrine relied heavily on fighter interception, not shipboard AA fire. When the dive bombers appeared overhead, there was almost nothing the ships could do. Akagi's captain, Taijiro Aoki, saw the bombers. He ordered evasive maneuvers, but a 37,000-ton carrier cannot turn quickly. The ship heeled, but it wasn't enough. Kaga's crew spotted the attack a few seconds later. Soryu turned hard to port. None of it mattered. The American dive bombers were already committed. Raymond Spruance made a decision early on June 4th that defined the battle. He launched his strike aircraft at extreme range, around 175 miles from the Japanese carriers. This meant his pilots would have barely enough fuel to attack and return. Some wouldn't make it back at all. But it also meant the strike would arrive earlier than the Japanese expected, potentially catching them unprepared. Spruance was criticized later for the decision. Many pilots ran out of fuel on the return flight and ditched in the ocean. Some were never recovered. But the early launch meant the dive bombers arrived during that narrow window when the Japanese carriers were rearming. If Spruance had waited, Nagumo might have launched his own strike first. The entire battle could have turned. Fletcher, commanding Yorktown, made a different choice. He held back a reserve, launched later, and sent Yorktown's bombers in coordination with his torpedo squadron. This contributed to the near-simultaneous arrival of multiple American squadrons over the Japanese fleet. Neither admiral knew the other's exact timing, neither coordinated directly, but both made decisions that, combined, created the conditions for victory. Nagumo, by contrast, hesitated. When the first report of American ships arrived at 7 a.m., he delayed committing fully to a strike. He wanted more information. He wanted his Midway strike aircraft recovered first. He wanted certainty. That hesitation meant his carriers were caught in the worst possible state. Decks full of aircraft, fuel lines exposed, ordnance scattered, fighters out of position. Leadership is often measured in minutes. Spruance's decision to launch early bought minutes. McCluskey's decision to search beyond the expected contact point burned minutes, but led him to the target. Nagumo's hesitation wasted minutes. Those minutes became the margin between victory and annihilation. Japanese sailors on the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had just finished celebrating. The American torpedo attacks had been slaughtered. Not one had hit. The decks were crowded with pilots, mechanics, and deck crews preparing the counterstrike. Morale was high. Some men were laughing, joking about how poorly the Americans fought. Then someone looked up. The first Dauntless rolled into its dive. Then another. Then 10, 20, 30. Dark shapes against the bright sky, plummeting like hawks. There was no time to launch fighters. No time to man all the anti-aircraft guns. Barely time to shout a warning. On Akagi, Captain Ioki saw the bombers and knew instantly what was about to happen. He ordered hard to starboard. The ship began to turn. But the first bomb was already falling. Aoki watched it arc down, growing larger, impossibly fast. It missed the ship by 50 feet, exploding in the water off the port bow. The second bomb hit. It struck just aft of the midship elevator, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the upper hangar. The explosion ripped through aircraft parked below, igniting fuel and ordnance. Fire erupted from the hangar deck, belching black smoke. Within seconds, the stacked bombs, the land attack ordnance removed earlier and left sitting in passageways, began to cook off. Secondary explosions roared through the ship. On Kaga, 4 bombs hit in rapid succession. One struck near the island superstructure. Another hit forward, blowing a hole in the flight deck. A third penetrated into the hangar. The fourth hit aft. Fires erupted simultaneously in 3 locations. Parked aircraft exploded. Fuel lines ruptured. Within 3 minutes, Kaga was a floating inferno. Soryu took 3 bombs, all within 60 seconds. One hit directly on the flight deck elevator, jamming it and trapping aircraft below. Another penetrated the forward hangar. The third struck near the bridge. The explosions triggered the same cascade: fuel, ordnance, parked aircraft, all igniting at once. Flames roared through the ship. Japanese sailors tried to fight the fires. Damage control parties dragged hoses forward, but the water pressure failed. Bulkheads buckled in the heat. Explosions kept coming, not from American bombs, but from the ship's own ammunition. The carriers were killing themselves. From the water, Ensign George Gay watched it happen. He saw the pillars of smoke rising. He heard the dull crump of explosions rolling across the ocean. He saw men diving off the burning carriers into the sea. Later, he would say it looked like the end of the world. 22 a.m. The first Dauntless rolled inverted and pulled into a dive. Lieutenant Dick Best pushed the stick forward and felt the Dauntless tip over the edge. The horizon vanished. The ocean filled his windscreen. His vision narrowed to the target, Akagi's flight deck, a long rectangle sliding into the center of his bomb sight. The altimeter unwound. 17,000 feet. 15,000. The wind screamed over the dive brakes. The entire airframe shook. Below, Akagi was turning hard, trying to swing her bow away from the attack. White water churned at her stern. Best adjusted, nudging the stick, keeping the carrier centered in the painted circle on his windscreen. Flak bursts popped around him, black smudges against the blue sky. He ignored them. 12,000 feet. 10,000. The carrier was huge now, filling his vision. He could see men on the deck running. He could see the rows of parked aircraft. He could see the red circle painted on the flight deck, the rising sun emblem, Japan's symbol, bold and bright. 5,000 feet. 4,000. His thumb hovered over the bomb release. Wait. Not yet. The deck slid upward in the sight. 3,000 feet. Now! He pressed the release. The aircraft lurched as the 1,000-pound bomb dropped away. Best hauled back on the stick with both hands. The G-forces slammed into him. His vision grayed. The Dauntless groaned, pulling out of the dive, leveling off barely 1,000 feet above the water. Best banked hard and looked back. The bomb hit just aft of Akagi's midship elevator. The flight deck erupted in a geyser of flame and steel. Smoke poured from the wound. Best didn't wait to see more. He shoved the throttle forward and headed east, back toward Enterprise, hoping he had enough fuel. Behind him, 2 more bombs hit Akagi within seconds. One struck forward near the bow. Another hit near the island superstructure. Each detonation tore through the ship's interior, igniting fuel and ammunition. The hangar deck, crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, became an inferno. Half a mile away, Wade McCluskey's remaining bombers were diving on Kaga. McCluskey himself led the attack. His bomb hit near the island. The explosion shattered the bridge structure and killed most of the command staff instantly. 3 more bombs followed, 1 forward, 2 amidships. Kaga's flight deck buckled. Fire blasted through the elevator shafts. The hangar deck exploded. Kaga's damage control parties tried to respond, but the fires were already out of control. The removed land attack bombs, stacked carelessly along passageways, detonated in the heat. The blasts ripped through bulkheads and collapsed decks. Men were thrown against steel walls or incinerated instantly. The ship shuddered with each internal explosion. To the north, Yorktown's bombers dove on Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie led the attack, but his bomb release mechanism had malfunctioned earlier. His bomb had dropped accidentally while still over open water. He dove anyway, drawing anti-aircraft fire away from his squadron. His pilots followed one after another, rolling into near-vertical dives. 3 bombs hit Soryu in less than a minute. The first struck just forward of the midship elevator, punching through the flight deck and detonating among parked aircraft. The second hit near the island. The third struck aft. Fuel ignited instantly. Soryu's narrow flight deck became a river of fire. Trapped aircraft exploded, hurling flaming debris across the deck. The ship's firefighting systems failed. The fires spread below, into the hangar deck, into crew compartments, into ammunition magazines, 26 a.m. In 4 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were burning. On Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo stood frozen, staring at the flames consuming his flagship. The deck was split open in 3 places. Smoke poured from the wounds, black and oily, rising into the clear sky like funeral pyres. Below decks, explosions continued, dull, rhythmic, relentless. The ship shuddered with each blast. Fire control parties reported total failure. The water mains were ruptured. Ammunition was cooking off. The hangar deck was an oven. Nagumo's staff urged him to transfer his flag to a cruiser. He hesitated. Akagi had been his flagship for months. She'd led the attack on Pearl Harbor. She'd struck Darwin, Colombo, Trincomalee. She was the symbol of Japanese carrier power. Now she was dying beneath his feet. Captain Aoki, tears streaming down his face, begged the admiral to leave. The fires were spreading. The bridge itself would soon be engulfed. Nagumo finally nodded. At 10:46 a.m., he and his staff climbed down to a waiting cutter and transferred to the light cruiser Nagara. As the cutter pulled away, Aoki remained aboard Akagi, trying desperately to save his ship. It was already hopeless. Kaga was worse. 4 bomb hits had gutted her. The flight deck was a twisted mass of metal. The hangar deck was an inferno. The forward magazines exploded at 10:40 a.m., blowing the bow section apart. Men dove from the deck into the ocean, their clothes on fire. Some never surfaced. Others floated, burned and screaming, waiting for rescue that came too slowly or not at all. Captain Jisaku Okada ordered abandoned ship at 11 a.m. But the order never reached many of the crew trapped below. Bulkheads had collapsed. Passageways were blocked by fire or wreckage. Hundreds of men were sealed in compartments, banging on steel walls, choking on smoke. Kaga listed to starboard, her stern settling lower. She would burn for hours before sinking that evening. Soryu's end came fastest. 3 bomb hits triggered fires that spread with terrifying speed. Her narrow hull, designed for speed and agility, offered little space for damage control. The fires reached the forward aviation fuel tanks at 10:45 a.m. The explosion broke the ship's back. Her bow lifted out of the water. Men tumbled from the angled deck into the sea. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to leave the bridge. His officers pleaded with him. He waved them away, standing rigid, staring at the flames. Soryu sank at 7:13 p.m. that evening. Yanagimoto went down with her. But one Japanese carrier remained untouched. Hiryu had been steaming separately from the other 3 carriers, several miles to the north. The American dive bombers hadn't spotted her. As Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned, Hiryu turned into the wind and launched a counterstrike. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, aimed at Yorktown. The Japanese were wounded, but not yet defeated. Hiryu's strike found Yorktown at 12:20 p.m. 8 dive bombers broke through the combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire. 3 bombs hit. One penetrated deep into the ship and exploded in the forward boiler room, extinguishing 5 of Yorktown's 9 boilers. The ship lost power, slowed, and began listing. Damage control parties fought to stabilize her. They succeeded temporarily. By 1:40 p.m., Yorktown was making 17 knots, her fires under control. Then Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 torpedo bombers. They found Yorktown at 2:45 p.m. 2 torpedoes hit her port side, rupturing fuel tanks and flooding compartments. The list increased to 26 degrees. Power failed completely. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship at 3 p.m. The crew climbed down ropes into the water. Yorktown stayed afloat, listing heavily, but she would survive for 2 more days before a Japanese submarine finished her off. But Hiryu's triumph was brief. American scout planes located her at 2:45 p.m. Enterprise launched a strike immediately. 24 dive bombers from both Enterprise and the orphaned Yorktown squadrons, now operating from Enterprise's deck. They found Hiryu at 5 p.m., steaming northwest, her flight deck clear, preparing to recover her returning aircraft. The dive bombers rolled in. 4 bombs hit. One struck forward, blowing the flight deck elevator into the air. Another hit amidships, penetrating into the hangar. A third hit near the island. The 4th struck aft. Hiryu erupted in flames. Her aircraft, returning from the Yorktown strike, circled overhead, unable to land. They ran out of fuel one by one and ditched into the ocean. Hiryu burned through the night. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commander of the carrier division, and Captain Tomeo Kaku refused to abandon ship. They stood on the bridge as the fires consumed the vessel. At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, Yamaguchi ordered a destroyer to torpedo Hiryu. The torpedoes hit. Hiryu rolled over and sank, taking Yamaguchi and Kaku with her. By dawn on June 5th, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone, sunk or sinking, burning or already beneath the waves. 6 months of dominance erased in 6 minutes. The pilots who'd struck Pearl Harbor, who'd ranged across the Pacific, who'd believed themselves invincible. Most were dead, drowned or floating in life rafts, waiting for rescue. The battle wasn't over. Yamamoto still had battleships, cruisers, destroyers. But without carriers, without air cover, the fleet was blind and vulnerable. He ordered a general withdrawal. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. The trap had closed on the wrong fleet. The ocean burned. 4 massive oil slicks marked where the carriers had died. Debris floated everywhere. Life rafts, shattered aircraft, pieces of hull plating, charred wood, bodies. Japanese destroyers moved through the wreckage, pulling survivors from the water. Some men had been in the ocean for hours. Some were burned beyond recognition. Some died as they were hauled aboard. The casualty counts were staggering. Akagi lost 221 men. Kaga lost 811. Soryu lost 711, including her captain. Hiryu lost 392, including Admiral Yamaguchi. over 2,000 Japanese sailors dead. But the greater loss was inexperience. The pilots, the veterans who'd trained for years, who'd flown combat missions since Pearl Harbor, were gone. Some died in the initial bomb strikes, trapped on the burning flight decks. Others died when their aircraft, unable to land on the destroyed carriers, ran out of fuel and crashed into the sea. Japan's naval aviation would never recover. New carriers could be built, new aircraft could be manufactured. But new pilots took years to train, and Japan no longer had years. The instructors who would have trained them were dead. The accumulated experience, the institutional knowledge, the skill built through hundreds of combat missions, all of it sank with the carriers. American losses were significant, but not crippling. Yorktown was crippled and later sunk by a Japanese submarine on June 7th. The destroyer USS Hammond, alongside Yorktown providing power and pumps, was also sunk by the same submarine. 147 American sailors died. 50 American aircraft were lost, most from the torpedo bomber squadrons that had been massacred in the morning attacks. But Enterprise and Hornet were untouched. Their air groups, though depleted, were intact. Midway itself, though damaged in the initial Japanese air raid, remained operational. And most critically, the pilots who'd sunk the Japanese carriers survived. Best, McCluskey, Leslie. They made it back to their carriers. They would fly again. Raymond Spruance was hailed as a hero, though he deflected the praise. He insisted the victory belonged to the pilots, the men who'd flown the obsolete Dauntlesses into 70-degree dives and held steady through flak and fire. He was right. Tactical genius meant nothing without execution. The pilots had executed. Admiral Nimitz flew to Midway a week later to assess the damage and congratulate the survivors. He understood what had been won. Japan's offensive in the Pacific had been stopped. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. American morale, battered since Pearl Harbor, surged. The Navy had proven it could fight and win. But Nimitz also understood the cost. Yorktown was gone. Dozens of aircraft were lost. More than 100 men were dead. And the war was far from over. Japan still controlled vast territories. They still had carriers, though fewer. They still had battleships, cruisers, destroyers. The fight would continue for years. Across the Pacific, in Tokyo, the news of the defeat was suppressed. The Japanese government announced a successful withdrawal after strategic objectives were achieved. Newspapers printed triumphant headlines. The public was told nothing of the 4 carriers. Families of the dead were given vague notices. The truth was kept secret, even from much of the Japanese military. But within the Navy, the truth couldn't be hidden. Officers knew. Pilots knew. The men who'd survived the battle knew. Japan had gambled at Midway and lost. The initiative in the Pacific had shifted. The Americans were no longer reacting. They were acting. The strategic consequences of Midway unfolded over the following months. Japan's plan to expand eastward and force a negotiated peace collapsed. Instead, the United States began its own offensive. On August 7, 1942, just 2 months after Midway, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It was the first major American amphibious assault of the war. Japan, still reeling from the carrier losses, couldn't muster a coordinated response. The Guadalcanal campaign became a grinding attrition battle that lasted 6 months. Japan committed resources it could no longer afford to lose. Reinforcements were ferried down the slot in nighttime runs, constantly harassed by American aircraft. Naval battles erupted in the waters around the island. Savo Island, Cape Esperance, the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Japan lost more ships, more aircraft, more pilots. By February 1943, Japan evacuated Guadalcanal. Another defeat, another retreat. Midway had broken the back of Japanese carrier aviation. By late 1942, Japan had only 2 fleet carriers operational, Shokaku and Zuikaku, both veterans, but now without the skilled pilots who'd once flown from their decks. New carriers were under construction, but they wouldn't be ready until 1944. And even when they arrived, there would be no experienced air crews to fly from them. The Douglas SBD Dauntless, meanwhile became the backbone of American naval aviation. The plane that had been derided as obsolete in early 1942 continued to serve through 1944. It fought at Guadalcanal, the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, and dozens of smaller engagements. Dauntlesses sank more Japanese shipping than any other Allied aircraft. They destroyed enemy fortifications, supported amphibious landings, and escorted other bombers. By the time the Dauntless was finally retired in late 1944, replaced by the more advanced Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, it had compiled a combat record unmatched in naval aviation history. The pilots who flew at Midway became legends. Richard Best was medically retired in 1944 after inhaling caustic soda fumes from a faulty oxygen system. Ironically, the injury occurred during the Midway battle, but he continued flying for months afterward. Wade McCluskey eventually rose to Rear Admiral. Max Leslie survived the war and continued serving in the Navy until 1956. Many others didn't survive. The torpedo bomber pilots who'd gone in first, whose sacrifice had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level and made the dive bomber attack possible, most of them died that day. Torpedo Squadron 8 lost all 15 aircraft and 29 of 30 aircrew. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, was killed in the initial attack. His bravery and the bravery of his squadron went largely unrecognized for years. They'd achieved nothing tactically, no hits, no damage. But strategically they'd pulled Japanese defenses out of position. The dive bombers succeeded because the torpedo bombers had died first. For Japan, Midway marked the beginning of an irreversible decline. Japanese industrial capacity couldn't match American production. In 1942, the United States launched 7 fleet carriers. In 1943, 6 more. In 1944, 14. By 1945, American carriers dominated the Pacific, launching strikes at will against Japanese targets. Japan launched only 3 new fleet carriers between 1942 and 1945, and all were sunk before contributing meaningfully to the war. Japanese naval doctrine never adapted. The emphasis remained on decisive offensive action, the single crushing blow. But Japan no longer had the forces to deliver that blow. The pilots lost at Midway were irreplaceable. Training new pilots required fuel, resources, and time Japan didn't have. By 1944, Japanese pilots were being sent into combat with minimal training. They flew outdated aircraft against vastly superior American pilots in superior aircraft. The results were predictable. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 saw Japanese naval aviation effectively annihilated, over 600 aircraft destroyed in a single day. The psychological impact was just as profound. Before Midway, Japanese forces believed they were destined to win. After Midway, doubt crept in. American forces, by contrast, gained confidence. They'd proven they could sink Japanese carriers. They'd proven the Dauntless, despite its reputation, was a war-winning weapon. They'd proven that courage, skill, and a little luck could overcome a numerically superior enemy. Midway also validated American intelligence work. The codebreakers at Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had provided the intelligence that made the victory possible. Their work continued throughout the war, providing crucial information that guided American strategy. Rochefort himself was controversially denied the Distinguished Service Medal during the war, a result of inter-service rivalries, but was finally awarded it posthumously in 1985. The battle demonstrated the importance of timing. 6 minutes, the window during which the dive bombers struck, decided the outcome. If the American squadrons had arrived 10 minutes earlier, the Japanese fighters would still have been at altitude. If they'd arrived 10 minutes later, Nagumo's strike might have launched. In war, minutes matter. Timing matters. And on June 4, 1942, the timing aligned perfectly for the United States. June 4, 1942. 6 minutes. 4 carriers. The Douglas SBD Dauntless, slow and ungainly, derided as obsolete, proved that technology alone doesn't win wars. It's the combination, machine, pilot, timing, and fortune, that matters. The Dauntless was exactly what it needed to be: stable, rugged, accurate. In the hands of skilled pilots, at the right moment it became devastating. History turns on such moments. A decision to launch early, a hunch to search beyond the expected point, a delay that becomes perfect timing, the courage to hold steady in a 70-degree dive while flak bursts around you and the ocean rushes up to meet you, the willingness to trust an obsolete machine because you know, deep in your bones, that it will do what you ask of it. The Japanese pilots couldn't believe it. They'd dominated for 6 months. They'd sunk battleships, destroyed armies, conquered empires, and then, in 6 minutes, 3 of their fleet carriers were burning. A 4th would follow hours later. The men who'd flown from those decks, who'd believed themselves invincible, were dead or dying. The war had turned, and they hadn't seen it coming. Midway wasn't the end. 3 more years of brutal fighting lay ahead. Island-hopping campaigns, kamikazes, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the atomic bombs, Japan's surrender. But the trajectory was set on June 4, 1942. The initiative passed to the United States. Japan would never regain it. Wars are not won by nations. They are won by individuals. Pilots who push the stick forward, sailors who fight fires in the belly of a burning ship, intelligence officers who break codes in basement rooms, admirals who make decisions with incomplete information and trust that they're right. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was just a machine, but the men who flew it were not. They were human, fallible, brave, and in that single moment above the Pacific Ocean, they changed the course of history. The sun set on June 4, 1942, over an ocean scattered with debris and burning oil. 4 Japanese carriers were gone. The battle was over. The war continued. But the men who flew the Dauntless knew, as they landed back on their carriers with fuel gauges reading empty, that they had done something impossible. They had turned the tide.